Hello and welcome to Sprott Radio. I'm your host, Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner at Sprott. With me today is Zion Lights. Zion is an award-winning author and environmental activist for a higher energy, low-carbon future. Zion, thank you for joining Sprott Radio.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Zion, being a new guest to Sprott Radio, I thought it would be helpful to start with a bit of your background and some of the work you're doing and the things you're passionate about. If you don't mind kind of walking us through that to kick this off, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm a science communicator. So I deal with data and facts, but trying to turn those into stories to help people to understand, the basics of science and technology and how they underpin the way society works, which, probably a lot of people I think are aware of now because there's a lot of misinformation around. And that kind of brings me to the nuclear world. I didn't deliberately go into talking about nuclear. It was something I kind of fell into as someone who had my own reservations about it, who'd been misled by misinformation, and then started kind of doing a bit of myth busting and unexpectedly took off. And I've now spoken in, many countries around the world about this clean energy. And I'm pleased to say that in just the last few years, the tide has massively turned and it's shifted very much. The narrative's shifted very much, which I think is promising in showing that you can combat misinformation, because doing that work has made a huge difference. Why
do you think there's so much misinformation out there as it relates to energy and the environment? Why do people kind of use a scare tactic, so to speak, when they talk about that space?
So we spread it. Environmentalists spread it. There are many different reasons. I would say that for nuclear specifically, it goes back to the anti-weapons movement. Over here, we called it the C&D, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, but I think there are different groups around the world. And I genuinely think, look, I've known these people, I've worked with these people, I've blocked roads with these people. Their hearts are in the right places. I know a lot of people don't like me saying that. They say, well, they call us shills and they're horrible and blah, blah, blah. But they genuinely have been misled themselves. Where that goes back to, like where the inception is, we can only speculate, But basically what I would say is there were some people who had these fears, whether legitimately or for nefarious reasons. They had these fears and they were excellent communicators. They were brilliant storytellers. And those stories have lasted for decades. Mm-hmm. And most of the narrative that we had about nuclear energy has come from those people from decades ago. So when I was growing up, I was afraid of nuclear energy. I watched The Simpsons, nuclear's the bad guy. Who's the worst person in The Simpsons? Mr. Burns. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I believe that was true of the industry necessarily, but these pop culture references have a knock-on effect and you see it repeated everywhere. And if you don't actually know anyone who works in the nuclear industry, you don't actually know a nuclear engineer or anything like that, it's never challenged. And I think that's where we kind of fell flat, is that the scientific community wasn't challenging it enough. And the industry wasn't challenging it. They stayed very quiet. And, good stories are powerful. And as soon as I started telling better stories, I found a lot of people kind of wake up the same way I did and say, oh, maybe I've been wrong on that. Maybe I've been misled. And that's where most people were kind of in the middle. The people that were very, very anti were a minority. And I think you find that in almost all cases of any kind of misinformation, whether it's around GMOs or vaccines or nuclear or something else. It's usually a very small minority, but they're excellent storytellers. And the stories they tell, frankly, they're more powerful than the science and technology that we develop because they overtake those. They control those in a way. And that's what happened. And, now I think it's shifting back. And even a lot of those people, to be fair to them, have gone, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was misled. And that's great. But I think that does show a bit of a broader failure of society to kind of engage those individuals who, frankly, a lot of them came from Britain or the US, where they've been through the science education system. So something's failing there, right? If people come out of that and they believe that the earth is flat, that's a societal failure. I don't think we can put it all on the activists. They then run with a fear that they have, thinking that they're doing something good in the world, when actually they've done quite a lot of damage.
You talk a lot about misconceptions out there. And I wonder if you could maybe tackle some of those misconceptions and how we're overcoming them. Because as you said, you mentioned you had blocked roads with some of these people in the past as well. So how did you get to the other side? And what are some of those big misconceptions that you're trying to help people overcome through your storytelling, through being a scientific communicator? If you could talk about that a bit, I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. So, my mind did not change overnight. It took many years. And it wasn't through facts and, people telling me that I was wrong and I should read this book or that book. Although I did go away and read different books and I did start questioning the things that I believed. It was actually a friend of mine called John, who is an engineer, who would just have these conversations with me. And reflecting on that now, he must have been so frustrated and annoyed when I said things like, well, the waste is, harmful for millions of years and all this nonsense. But he was very patient with me and he just challenged. He just said, well, actually, this is what's true. And people underestimate that kind of communicator trust that really has a strong influence on people. And the trust I had for him suddenly started to weigh more than the trust that I had for the environmentalists that I'd listened to for many years. And I started thinking, well, John's a good guy. John wouldn't lie to me. And John doesn't work for the industry. He has no dog in this race, so maybe he's right. And so a slow shift started to happen. And what actually really helped was that I would take the things he'd said back to that community and I'd say, well, John said, and it was their very volatile, angry reactions that made me kind of go, well, he's not talking like that. He's speaking in a measured way. Why are these people so having such knee-jerk reactions? And I think that's actually always a good sign to look out for. If someone's spreading misinformation, they almost always react, like in a panic. That's not a good place to make decisions from. So I kind of came around to the logic, largely thanks to his help, to be honest. But it just goes to show how many years was I in that movement before anyone bothered to engage me. And I'm not saying that, I couldn't have done my own research or whatever, but actually I was reading Greenpeace reports, which are outright misinformation. Those reports still exist today. They are telling you that all these people died at Fukushima, for example, which isn't true, that fish are dying in huge numbers, that isn't true. If you're a kid, why would you say, well, that must be false? You will believe those reports. They seem like a good, well-meaning organization. The main myths that I have dealt with have been around waste, as I mentioned. That is something that used to worry me. Again, some of it was from pop culture references, but a lot of it was from official reports from so-called green groups, saying really awful things about waste and how it's not managed. And, if only they'd put that effort into tackling fossil fuels instead, where there actually is a waste problem, where it's not managed, where it is stored in the Earth's atmosphere as we speak. So that was one of the main things. And actually I feel like that's quite an easy one to dispel, because in the first place, what people think of as waste is just complete opposite to what it is. I think this is green, acidic, goopy liquid. It's solid and it's very minimal. And yes, it's radioactive, but then we can have discussions about, well, everything's, every living thing is radioactive and some non-living things besides. And then we can have discussions about, well, why are people radiophobic? Why do people protest 5G or, X-ray? Some people will refuse to have X-rays or cancer treatment because they're so radiophobic. There's a lot to be said for having these discussions. And for a lot of those people, they've kind of been let down by society because those fears and those anxieties have run rampant and never been challenged in an effective way, which is why I think science communication is really important. It's not just about, throwing facts at people or what a lot of people think of as science communication. It's about having those conversations and meeting people where they're at and just being kind of reasonable in hearing their concerns. And I would say the primary concerns have always been waste and radiation. And whereas waste has been completely overblown, radiation is I think it's a fair fear. It's a fair fear. You're extremely unlikely to be exposed to high levels of radiation, but the idea of it is scary. And that's why there are so many stories across, you think literature or films, and, they're compelling. I find them compelling, and it does stoke a fear in you, even though, you're far more likely to have an accident when you get in a car, right? Nobody fears that. Everybody just does it every day. We fear instead these huge, really unlikely scenarios. Yes, there have been cases where that's happened, but that's been to do with weapons and not energy. And that's another really useful point that you can kind of tell people, because it's factually correct and they can go and look it up, and it can just help unpick some of those stories that they've been told for a long time.
Well, to your point, between the Simpsons and Marvel Comics, half the superheroes have been exposed to radioactivity, and that's why they have their superpowers. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of stories out there along the way that sort of fuse people's view of it. It's interesting because as we go down this path of renewable, sustainable energy, nuclear has been around for a long time, yet somehow in the last decade or so, wind and solar and hydro have really got most of front page news. And now more recently, nuclear is starting to kind of catch up. Can you talk about some of those other alternative energies out there, kind of maybe the pros and cons on those, and how nuclear could support that? That's part A. And then part B, I want to talk about coal, because you've done some really cool stuff with coal, some articles and so forth. So I want to shelf that for now. But can you talk about wind, solar, and hydro for a minute and how that relates to nuclear?
Sure. So you're right. Wind and solar have a really excellent public image. And I know this is going to sound really silly, but I think it comes down to something really basic. I say this from being in the environmental movement for a long time. Wind and solar are seen as natural. And I know that's a really fuzzy, ridiculous idea, but it is true. I still know people who will argue, well, they're natural because they last forever and they come from the elements, completely ignoring the fact that these are huge infrastructure projects that require a lot of mining and minerals, and actually far more than nuclear requires, right? They're not doing that deliberately. They just have this really beautiful image in their head of wind and sun, it's replenishable and it's natural. Whereas nuclear seems unnatural. It seems, man-made. And I say man-made, not human-made specifically, because this is one of the things environmentalists have said for a long time. It's a very male thing that men created it. It's true. Helen Caldicott, brilliant communicator, extremely powerful in the anti-nuclear movement for many years. She's still a very prominent activist. She has given multiple speeches where she speaks to women predominantly, saying, this is a male energy. We don't need this. We want the natural elements. Whereas, of course, if you really think about it, atoms make up everything, right? What's more natural than atoms? But let's not get into that, because it's silly. It's silly. But let's also be honest that people respond to good marketing. That single slogan about a product that makes you go and buy it, that's really powerful. And that's happened with wind and solar. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't build wind and solar. They are clean. We are comparing these energies, after all, to fossil fuels. We want to replace fossil fuels, especially coal, because gas is a little bit better than coal, but especially coal. But if we can just phase them out as much as possible and have clean energy sources, that will be better for all of us. Even if you don't care about climate change, I personally do. I know a lot of people will argue with me on that. Air pollution alone kills millions of people from fossil fuels. We know this. We've known this for a long time. People fear radiation when you're far more likely to be harmed by air pollution, and we could tackle that right now. You want to talk about invisible killers? Air pollution should be up there, and that's another thing I think the environmental movement got wrong, is that we should have really been arguing that message. It's happening a little bit more now, but again, when I started out doing this, nobody cared, no one was talking about it, and when they would just say, well, we need wind and solar. Well, that's not going to solve it. Let's be honest. We need really robust, reliable energy systems. You can have some in wind and solar, but the base load or reliable form of energy will always be, until we develop fusion or something else, something better, it will be nuclear or hydropower. And that's, if you look at all the industrializations in the world, that's what they have. They have a base load of clean, reliable, either nuclear or hydro, and then they top it up with wind and solar. And then when it's not windy or sunny enough, they import fossil fuels. Now, that's the argument for, sure, you can add wind and solar to the grid, and you can also have the storage, but it will only last so long. It only lasts a few hours. So you still need to have something clean and reliable so that you're not ending up importing coal, which is what we do in Britain. When our wind drops, when it's windy, great. Yeah, everything's powered by wind. That's what the headlines say anyway. But as soon as that stops, as soon as it drops, then we import coal. So it would be great if we could have hydro. But the fact is, it's geographically restricted. Only some places in the world can have it, and where they do, they use it abundantly. Sweden, Norway. I don't want to speak against clean energies. We do need to use all the hydropower available to us. But again, people have this image of, well, it's natural because it's water. Well, hydropower has killed way more people than wind and solar and nuclear combined, right? Because you think things like the Bankyo Dam disaster, it's killed hundreds of thousands of people. Nuclear is nowhere near that number. It's not even in the hundreds. It's funny that it has such a positive image when it's actually potentially more dangerous. And it also displaced many, many people as well. So, because people will then say, wow, you're saying that about nuclear, but look at all the people it's displaced. Hydropower has displaced far more people. What I would say about that is nothing is zero risk, and we should stop pretending that things should be zero risk. We should minimize as much as we can as possible. But the fact is, nothing is completely safe. And that's also true of wind and solar. We really have to look at these things in context and compare them with fossil fuels and just go, well, those are really unsafe. That's so polluting. Why haven't we phased that out already? Why are we squabbling and arguing about the minute details of these clean energy sources when the future of humankind depends on them? And whether or not, again, you're worried about climate change and global heating, People are dying right now, today, because we aren't phasing out those fossil fuels from air pollution. And that's been happening for a long time, and we've known that. And we've not done enough, is what I would say.
We talk a lot about health and safety, but let's boil down to just reliability and affordability. We have 8 billion plus people in the world today, right? And clean energy probably is important to maybe 1 billion of the 8. And the other 7, they just want power. They want to turn a light switch on and have a light. I guess the bigger question then is, why are we putting one so much against another? And why are we not recognizing that we need them all? We need wind, we need solar, we need hydro, we need nuclear. We still need fossil fuels. We're still powering with coal and so forth. And these are long projects. Is it fair to say that many of the people out there, or many of the narratives out there, are putting one against the other instead of saying we need a more holistic solution to this space? And I guess part 2 of that would be then, is nuclear sort of the base for that to support all these other energy sources out there?
Nuclear has to be the base until we create something better. It just has to be. It's proven to be able to do this already. It may be that we have more small modular reactors moving forward. You know, the advanced tech is moving very quickly. But even then, I would not say that that's proven for decarbonizing a grid. If we're talking about reducing emissions right now, we know it's big old fission. We know it's worked. It's worked in France since the 80s. They completely decarbonized in around 15 years. You know, we know the model that we need to be following, really. I think it's worrisome when the developed nations, for want of a better phrase, point at the underdeveloped nations and say, we want you to stop burning fossil fuels, which is what happens, right, every year at COP. And then you get countries like India turning around and saying, how dare you, frankly, because they still have billions of people to lift out of poverty.
Right.
And they are not going to do that with intermittent energy sources. They're just not. That's wishful thinking. It's not been shown to work in developed nations. Germany tried to do it. People like to say that it's about underinvestment or political will, but Germany's a really good case study of a country that put trillions into wind and solar. Now, that, on the one hand, it did bring down the costs globally, so great. But did they manage to reduce their emissions the way that France did in a decade? No, they didn't. They really tried. Now, you might say, well, you know, the Nord Stream pipeline thing happened and there were elements that they didn't plan for. We all have that image, don't we, of the village being cleared for coal and all the protesters protesting it. Germany has a lot of coal and they're now using it, and it's very dirty. It's the dirtiest kind. It's lignite. It's easy for countries like that where they can fall back on that. What happens in India or Africa if you give them, you know, intermittent sources and then they have blackouts and they have energy scarcity? They can't just say, well, I'll just mine here, or I'll just import this here. They don't have the financial means of doing that. I think one of the problems with the conversation is we don't treat the conversations differently enough. It's different in the developed nations where we absolutely have the capacity and capability and finances and workforce to decarbonize within a matter of years. And then, like you say, quite a lot of the world who is not there yet, they are still not had their industrial revolutions or green revolutions, even in agriculture. They're where we were once, and we should help them. We should help them to push forward out of that, because we should alleviate poverty, absolutely. But that's not going to happen by, you know, sending a few solar farms to Indian villages, which is what some of these NGOs are doing. That's not going to happen. That's not what we had to develop. And that development is really key, actually, if you care about environmental standards. The one thing that we found, again, to lower emissions, to bring up environmental standards, is development. Because what happens is places like, you think China's building a lot of clean energy. They're building more nuclear reactors than anywhere else in the world. They're building more solar and wind as well. What happens is these countries, just like us, they build and build, and they burn lots of coal, and they realize, great, we've reached a certain level of development, but wow, people are sick. You know, the air is dirty. Let's now transition to clean technologies. That's the way that it happens. There's no leapfrogging. I know a lot of people wish for that, but again, it's just not been the case throughout history, and it's not for lack of trying. And it puts these countries in a very precarious position to try to get them to do that. And frankly, I think just makes them care less about things like climate change. And if you're struggling to put food on the table, the last thing you care about is climate change or even the air you breathe. And I think everyone should have access to good air. You don't think kids should be suffering living next to coal-fired power stations in other countries so that we can import that electricity when we feel like it. We never allow it at home, but we will import it from poorer nations. But yeah, it's more complicated There was a study recently I saw about discussing nuance just isn't very popular. If you think on social media, kind of the sound bites that go viral that people really appreciate, they're bold. They might not be true, but they're bold. They're very black and white. But the reality of anything is really black and white, and energy systems are actually really complicated. And what you talk about in Britain is different to what you can talk about in America or in Australia or anywhere in Asia, where there are many different countries with many different needs and populations. I hope to bring some of that discussion to the table, because I think it gets neglected even by world leaders who might be quite well-meaning, but they'll say things like, well, we'll just have to reach net zero. Well, quite a lot of countries have set net zero goals. How many countries are going to meet those?
You mentioned coal a few times, whether it's UK using coal plants when the wind slows down or what we've seen in Germany. Coal is getting a new chapter in its life as it relates to infrastructure, as it relates to potentially creating jobs or moving people from one skill set to another within the coal plant. And I think it's C2N, I think is the acronym, the coal to nuclear. Yeah. Talk about that, because I think that's a really cool narrative, really cool story that is inclusive of what we currently have and what we could have as it relates to coal to nuclear.
The research done on this is US specific, but it is relevant to any country that has had a successful coal program, because basically a lot of these coal-fired power stations have been mothballed, they've been phased out. But the infrastructure is sitting there. Now, the Department of Energy report that came out of the US very recently found that 80% of the sites across the US could be easily converted to nuclear sites. So if you think about the basic infrastructure that you need to put in place, I'm talking about the building, the concrete that's forming the control, what would be the control room, those can very easily be transitioned. And that's really important if you think about the cost and also the speed of building nuclear power stations, because a lot of that existing infrastructure is there. And it also tackles two other things. One, that kind of NIMBY element, people who don't want new infrastructure to be built. NIMBY, not in my backyard, which is very influential here as well. People want the idea of solar farms or wind turbines or nuclear power stations, but they don't want to live next to them. So if you use the existing sites, what you'll find is people who live next to nuclear power stations already have the highest acceptance of them. That's true globally. So there's research on that, because they're used to it. They know there's nothing to fear, but also because the communities benefit from the jobs. And that's the other crucial aspect of the C2N, is that transitioning those old coal-fired power stations to nuclear stations, they found that they could retain quite a lot of that local workforce. So a lot of those people who have lost jobs from the coal industry, who are bitter and maybe angry about action on climate change, a lot of them, they're engineers or they're builders. They're things that can be transitioned, they're vocations that can be transitioned across to the nuclear world with maybe a little bit of training. They already have a lot of the expertise there, which also makes it easier in terms of, for example, here we want to build more nuclear. The workforce isn't here, right? We don't have the workforce, and training that workforce. I think people underestimate, how much time and energy that would take. In fact, the previous government, we just had an election, but the previous government was looking at bringing retired workers back to get nuclear built, offering these packages. And yeah, plenty of people were taking them up, but come on, come on.
That's not sustainable.
We need, I always think the measure of any society can kind of be gauged by the number of engineers.
We need more Johns, as you said earlier.
Yeah, you and I can sit here and talk all day, but the fact is the people getting their hands dirty who are building the infrastructure, whether, and it's not just about clean energy, it's also about railways or housing. They are the ones that we need to get the economy going, to set those high environmental standards so that we, can have homegrown energy at home instead of importing it from countries that have lower environmental standards, by the way, because they haven't reached that level of development that we have. So, there's a lot going on there, but I think it's really promising for the US. I actually think if you had a World War style effort of building, training and building, and maybe relaxing some of your over-regulation, I would call it, of nuclear, I think you could meet a 2050 target. Why not? France did it in 15 years in the 80s. And you actually have these sites that France didn't have, with existing infrastructure, with communities that already support a transition, who want the jobs. The US is, I think, depending on what happens in the next few years, really promising more than many other countries. Whereas in Britain, we have two main parties that are pro-nuclear in theory, right? The wording is great. Yep, let's build, let's get it done. But first of all, lack of skilled workforce. I mean,
Right.
we rely highly on immigration for that as it is, but even then, as we say, we're looking at bringing back retirees.
Right.
The lack of that, the other issues around, cost of living and housing expensive. There's not many incentives for young people to go in and study for years to get into do these, become engineers or whatever when they're not necessarily guaranteed well-paid jobs at the end. And then the regulation, which means that even if you've got a really good reactor, something like the South Korean APR 1000, which they've built in just a few years over there and exported to the UAE and showed that you can build it in a few years over there. If we try to build one here, it would take years even to get through the planning system and then a few more years to get through the environmental regulations. This is a European approved reactor as well. So you're skipping that bit. We won't meet our targets. There's absolutely no way. We won't meet them. I think the US looks far more promising. If it was a race, I'd say, you're ahead.
Will small modular reactors change some of that? Will you be able to actually manufacture something in one part of the world and ship it to another and plug it into an existing coal site and now have a nuclear power plant? Am I simplifying that?
No, that's basically is the idea. I mean, it's not that different to South Korea exporting the APR 1000. And they're also looking at bringing it to Africa. They're having talks with other countries about doing a similar thing there. But it is big nuclear. It's huge, right? It's big infrastructure projects. And there is an issue with huge infrastructure projects, not just for nuclear, but any large infrastructure project often takes a long time to build. It has cost overruns. People are really worrying about this now. It's a big public turnoff. And therefore, governments don't want to invest in it. And governments tend to think short term because they have a short term in office. They make a decision. Do they want to do something? What Pierre Mesmer did, the Prime Minister of France, when he came up with the Mesmer plan of building, he wanted to build like 80 reactors. They ended up building 50 something odd. He was thinking way beyond his term in office, right? Maybe even he could have been thinking way beyond his lifetime. It obviously didn't take that long, but there's no guarantee. And we've all seen that with the COVID pandemic and how that hit every industry everywhere. There's no guarantees ever. The difference with the SMRs is that you're looking at a much quicker timeline, a much smaller cost. And if they really get them down to being scalable, that's the challenge. So the technology exists. There are nuclear submarines powered by SMRs. But what we're looking at is, can we get them built in a factory like Lego models? One after the other, boom, 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 it's made, ship it. And yeah, you're right. Plug it into their existing system. In theory, it is a great idea, and that's why there are so many people racing to do it. You've got Bill Gates with his own company trying to do it, with his own reactor. Right. Every country pretty much has some kind of program, or is looking at investing in a program in another country. We have several here in the UK, and the government is funding them. I think it's always important to fund that advanced tech, and if it comes into play, brilliant. But my only concern is that while it tackles that idea of, well, we don't want the big projects, we don't want the big investment, it is as much a gamble, I think, as trying to go for a purely wind and solar grid. Like, it's an experiment, right? And if you're needing a lot more of them to meet the same demand of a large nuclear power plant, which you are, because they're small reactors, they produce a fraction of the electricity, then you're going to need more sites for them. And I think in the end, more public approval. Now, at the moment, they have a really good public perception. The people that know what they are quite positive about them, and they've had really good messaging, I think, as well. There's good branding. They don't seem to have the legacy of nuclear, but that might change when someone wants to put one in your neighborhood. And let's be honest, it's going to be more in your neighborhood than a large reactor is a little bit further away, because that's the idea. It's a small modular reactor. Stick it on a ship, stick it in your neighborhood. This infrastructure has to go somewhere. It has to. So I think the established route of what we've been doing is fine. Those communities are already supported. We should engage them, and we should keep building it. So, for example, in the UK, we have about 12 sites of decommissioned reactors just because they got old. They got really old, and they are old tech. Brilliant. Build them there, because the communities already support them. The communities are upset that they've lost the jobs, that their children have moved away because there are no jobs. I've visited some of these sites. I've written about it extensively. So one thing that Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg have been talking about is to power AI data centers. So we know artificial intelligence uses a lot of electricity. That's a nice idea, that you're going to have that site. It's your site. It's your infrastructure. You've already built it. And then you're powering it same way that you could power it with your own wind turbine or your own, solar panels, but they're being realistic that they know that that's not enough. And in recent years, they've suddenly come out and said, well, we do like those things and we have funded them, but they're not enough. Can we have these SMRs
Well, like so many things, I mean, tech tends to, in the last couple of decades, lead the way in public perception, and I applaud them for looking at, nuclear is a way to get to 24/7 baseload, and it also, I think, to your point earlier, shows people that look, you can't have a data center, you can't have AI that's dependable if it's intermittent. It has to be 24/7, and they're turning to nuclear for that. For our listeners today who do want to learn more about the work you're doing, how could one find you? How could one kind of look you up and see some of the work you're doing and some of the things you're reading, and what would you recommend out there?
So I have a website, zionlights.co.uk, where I have a section with all the articles I write and quite a lot of the interviews I do. So that's a good place to go if you want to see what else I'm saying. I also write on Substack, where I can dive much deeper into some of these topics. Substack is just my name, Zion Lights. It's also under the name Everything is Light, which is a Tesla quote. For other sites, I always recommend things like Our World in Data, which has a really good, simple overview of a lot of these areas we've talked about, even from how is something determined to be clean, what are the details around it, and how do we put the data together. So again, that's a really useful website. I'm everywhere. I'm all over social media, and I've just recently started making TikTok videos, which is new for me.
Okay.
So you can find me on there as well, at Z Loves Science.
Wonderful. Well, Zion, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Sprout Radio. I know our listeners certainly appreciate the information you shared, so thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is provided for information purposes only from sources believed to be reliable. However, Sprout does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Any opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not indicative of future results. This communication is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Any opinions and recommendations herein do not take into account individual client circumstances, objectives, or needs, and are not intended as recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies. You must make your own independent decisions regarding any securities, financial instruments, or strategies mentioned or related to the information herein. This communication may not be redistributed or retransmitted in whole or in part, or in any form or manner without the express written consent of Sprout. Any unauthorized use or disclosure is prohibited. Receipt and review of this information constitutes your agreement not to redistribute or retransmit the contents and information contained in this communication without first obtaining express permission from an authorized officer of Sprout.